This Week in Radio Tech, episode 139, is brought to you by the Telos Alliance and the informative Now catalog. Request yours at telosalliance.com/now. And by Win Connections. Gain insights on the Microsoft Technology Roadmap, October 29th through November 1st in Las Vegas. Visit winconnections.com and use code TECH100 when you register.
And now, our feature presentation.
Twert.
Can you teach, train, or tempt innovation and creativity? Friends and colleagues of the late Steve Church answer that question.
All right, calm down. He says that to everyone.
This calls for immediate discussion.
What's up, Doc?
All your days are belong to us.
From his palatial office of important business,
or in a choice hotel in a distant land.
This is Kirk Harnack.
On this special edition of Twert, you'll meet business partners, developers, and friends of Telos founder Steve Church.
You're dialed in to This Week in Radio Tech.
It's time for This Week in Radio Tech. Hi, I'm your host, Kirk Harnack. Thanks for joining us. Our program is brought to you by winconnections.com. Win Connections is a Windows conference that's a pretty exciting event going on October 29th through November 1st in Las Vegas. You can get more information by checking their website at winconnections.com. Also brought to you by the Telos Alliance, makers of a lot of fine broadcast equipment for radio and television, on the web at telosalliance.com. Well, today's show is just me bringing you some interviews and some audio clips and some thoughts about a famous inventor, famous creator, a guy who started a business that now today employs a lot of folks, provides income and further creativity and manufacturing, and it's the Telos company, and the guy is Steve Church. Steve Church was a friend of mine and friend to a lot of folks in the broadcast business, and Steve passed away last Friday after about a 4-year bout with brain cancer, and he died of complications from that. He lived a lot longer than the doctors said that he would, and in fact, some of the treatments that he looked into having done are now instrumental, and they're now part of the available palliative treatments for other people that had what he had, a form of brain cancer. Steve chose something that he wanted folks to know about, and that is this: we all die. The goal isn't to live forever. The goal is to create something that will. Now, those words were written by American novelist Chuck Palahniuk. They aptly describe the life of Steve Church. He was a talk show host, engineer, an entrepreneur, and founder of the Telos Corporation. He created many of the products that ushered broadcasting into the digital age, as well as the company that has been at the center of a lot of that. Telos Systems was started back in 1985 as a part-time project by Steve when he was chief engineer at a couple of Indianapolis radio stations, WFBQ and WNDE. He later moved on to Cleveland, Ohio, where he became chief engineer of WMMS, famous rock and roll station, The Buzzard, and WHK. He was still nursing along his little company at the same time. He invented the first product he invented was a telephone hybrid. You're going to hear something about that in the coming show and what that really meant to the broadcast business. He invented a product that he called the Telos 10. The sales of that product and the demand for it eventually grew to the point where Steve quit his day job and committed full-time to the company. Steve was the oldest of 4 brothers. He grew up in Lansing, Michigan, and according to his mother, who I got to meet last Sunday, Jacqueline Burgess, his interest in electronics began at about age 5. Steve's grandfather was an electronics hobbyist. He had a workshop in his basement, and Steve spent a lot of time there and learned all that he could. Later, Steve and his grandfather built a Heathkit stereo system together. His brother Todd Church adds that the first radio station he built was put together in his bedroom, and Steve was about 12 years old then. Now, how many of you in the audience, played with? I didn't play with transmitters myself. I played with receivers. I built some receivers at about age 12, 13 years old. Todd Church, Steve's brother, says he wired up all the equipment himself. He even had an oscilloscope and test gear to check it all out. Well, Steve's intense interest in radio occasionally got him into trouble, like many youngsters his age who were interested in broadcast engineering. He filled out what we used to call the bingo cards in broadcast magazines to get information on new products. You know, the magazines used to have those little tear-out cards, and you could circle the reader information numbers, and they'd forward those to manufacturers, and you'd get a catalog or something. Well, Steve wanted a copy of the latest Gates radio catalog, so he filled out that bingo card, and for the name of the company, he filled out Steve Church and Associates Broadcasting Consultants. And I remember Steve's about 13 years old here at the time. He got his Gates catalog, and that's when the trouble started. The Gates district sales manager was traveling through Michigan and decided to pay a call on Steve Church and Associates. Well, young Steve was in school that day, and his mother answered the door. The sales rep took the incident in stride, but his mom was not amused. Steve graduated from high school a couple years early. And he immediately began pursuing his interest in radio. He took a few courses in electronics. He took a few college courses. He never finished a degree. Does that sound familiar? Most of what he knew, he taught himself. His first job at the age of 16 was at a local station, WJPM, in Lansing. He was a board operator in the evenings. He moved to Florida. He worked as a DJ there for a while. And he ended up then becoming an engineer in Buffalo, and then at WFBQ in Indianapolis, and then also in Detroit. He worked there, and finally WMMS in Cleveland, as I mentioned earlier. He became interested in computer programming. That seemed like a worthwhile skill to have. And he even made a trip from his home in Michigan into Ohio when he was a boy to purchase one of these newly developed Ohio Scientific computers. I remember those. I didn't buy one, but Steve did. He had to find an operating system for this computer. And so Steve actually got on the phone and called up this little startup company called Microsoft. And he actually talked to a young software engineer there named Bill Gates. So, I mean, he's right at the cutting edge of all this new stuff. Well, as with many other technological innovations, the Telos 10 turned out that it was founded on a determination by Steve to do what was actually thought to be impossible. Now, let me explain that. Since the earliest days, telephone lines had been plagued by a kind of distortion known as side tone. Now, side tone is a little bit desirable. If you're talking on the phone, you want to see how loud you are. But you actually, in broadcasting, you don't want what you say into the phone to come back at you. You don't want this side tone. You want just to hear the caller coming back. And it was really problematic for radio stations that were doing talk shows. Well, a couple of decades earlier, Bell Labs had been working unsuccessfully to solve this problem. In fact, they published a paper at Bell Labs describing side tone distortion and declaring that the problem was unsolvable. There were 7 pages of formula in their paper from Bell Labs that says side tone was here to stay, can't be solved, just deal with it. Well, if you were a talk show host, you weren't happy about the way your phones were working at this time. And Steve Church, who was a talk show host, read that paper from Bell Labs. But he saw the problem in a different light. Rather than looking at side tone distortion from an analog perspective, he was able to look at it in the light of a new product, a new technology that was just becoming available called DSP, Digital Signal Processing. It was a new technology that had come to fruition in the late 1970s, and so Steve applied DSP adaptive filtering to this side tone distortion problem. Last February, I was very pleased to spend a whole day with Steve Church in Riga, Latvia. And more about that in a few minutes. And I had a question for Steve about how this DSP, how this really worked. And there are other engineers in our company who understand this quite well, but I never did understand it to the degree I wanted to. So Steve and I sat down in the conference room, and Steve, who was pretty sick at this time, drew out for me and described very carefully exactly how this DSP filtering worked. And it's incredible. It's an adaptive filter that basically adapts itself about 8,000 times a second to reduce and actually just basically eliminate this side tone distortion. Well, Steve's idea back in the early 1980s solved this problem. The Telos 10 hybrid was born. It was a milestone, not only because of the product itself, but because it was the first time that DSP technology had been applied to to any broadcast equipment, any that we know of. First DSP. Well, I'm going to show you some videos now, some interviews about folks who knew Steve at the time and understood some of the problems to be solved as well, or understood that there were problems here and were amazed that, wow, Steve's actually solving this. So I'm going to introduce you to some of Steve's colleagues, some of my colleagues as well, by way of interviews that were conducted in just the past few days. Also, we're going to hear from Steve himself. We were lucky to find a video of Steve at a NAB show from about 7 years ago, in 2004, I believe it was. I guess that'd be 5 years ago. And no, I can't do math here. 4 and 6, 7, 8, about 8 years ago, where Steve describes a story of how the Telos Zephyr came to be and how, well, you're going to have to wait for it. It's just an incredible story, and Steve tells it very well. So first of all, let me introduce you to Denny Sanders. Denny's a longtime friend and coworker with Steve Church. If you search YouTube for Denny Sanders and WMMS, don't do it now, do it later, you're going to find some old videos of Denny as a disc jockey, a long-haired, rock and roll, cigarette smoking disc jockey at the buzzer, WMMS. He looks a bit different now. He worked with Steve, and here's Denny to tell you about the significance of Steve's first DSP-based design, the Telos 10.
Part of the inspiration for him developing the Telos 10 was the fact that he was dabbling on the air previously, doing some radio talk shows as a host. And he was always completely dissatisfied with the quality of the phone call capability of putting on the air. And he always said that he wanted to correct this, make something that was better. A device that made callers clearer and made it possible for a caller and a host to speak at the same time, which was not possible with the somewhat primitive equipment that existed before. And part of the Telos 10's development was Steve as talent wanting a product which made his show sound better.
Well, not long after this, Frank Foti met up with Steve Church, and well, they had a chance to compare notes on phone hybrid designs. Here's Frank.
I officially met Steve on March 4th, 1985. I was working Mallrite Communications as chief engineer of Z100, but had in years earlier been the chief engineer at WMMS in Cleveland. And in the period of time after I'd left MMS, they had a couple guys that, you know, had moved on, and they were looking to have another chief engineer that to them was, I guess, kind of like the young vibe that I'd had. So I was asked to come to Cleveland, spend a few days with the new engineer that had been hired, because they wanted him to get off on the right foot. Well, I mean, literally in milliseconds, I knew they'd made the right hire. I mean, you just got it from Steve. But the reason I said it's a couple-part question is that I knew of Steve Church because in years, I think in the late 70s, Steve had actually made an analog hybrid that was part of a product line that he and Mark Durenberger started. It was called Telemix. And it was based on some VCAs and things of that nature. And I talked to him once, I believe when he was working in Buffalo. So I knew that Steve was like the telephone hybrid guru. And years prior to my being at Z100, I had developed an adaptable hybrid that was analog based, and I had a breadboard. It wasn't even a prototype, it was a breadboard that did work. I did this out in San Francisco when I was working at KNEW, and the idea was, you know, the few hybrids we tried, none of them measured up. So I was going to make this thing, and I tested it by, the concept of it was I'd injected a 100 hertz tone into the telephone line, and based on how the 100 hertz tone got disrupted, it would balance itself with VCAs to obtain a good hybrid null. And it worked pretty good. I used to, at the time, I used to call my grandmother in Cleveland, and Grandma, how you doing? And, you know, that's how we tested the thing. Well, I never built it because along came a little baby pea-shooter radio station at the top of the Empire State Building called Z100, and the idea got shelved. Now, I tell that story because years later, I'd shared this conversation with Glenn Clark, and apparently Glenn was going to be one of the people who originally built what became the Telos 10 for Steve. And Glenn had called me up and said, hey, that hybrid idea you told me about back in like '83, here's a guy that's going to do it digitally. And I'm thinking, really? And I needed to have good sounding phones in New York. So it was a sheer coincidence that a week later, I'm meeting this guy who I was told made this digital hybrid. So when I met him, I said, Steve, we met many years ago, but did you make a digital hybrid? He's like, in typical Steve fashion, Frank, why, yes. Steve, I want to buy one. And Steve was like, but Frank, you haven't heard it. And I said, but Steve, and I told him my story, and in typical Steve fashion, he said, he immediately went through all the reasons where the pitfalls would be in the analog version, which were true. And I said, Steve, I don't disagree with you. I said, that's why I wanted, you're actually adapting the hybrid filter. I didn't have a way in analog to, change the impedance and the reactance and all that stuff, which is what the Telos 10 did, or adjust to it. Yeah. I said, so of course it's got to sound good, and I got a great place to try it, New York City radio station. He's like, okay. And I said, what's the price? And I remember whatever, I said, sold. He's like, but you haven't heard it. I said, Steve, I want to buy one. And then right on the spot, this is like in the first 5 minutes I meet the guy. And he said, Frank, there's an among friends price. I said, sold. So 2 days later, he wanted to come to New York, see the Z100 studios, because we were going to rebuild MMS, their studios in Cleveland. And he brings it, we hook it up, and the cliche does apply. The rest is history. I mean, Scott Shannon heard it. Franco, how soon can you get this on the radio? And we did. And so, to answer your question, I knew immediately. I mean, you just knew when you were in his presence. The vibe was there. Steve is one of these guys that, you could, I think speaking about him the other day, I mean, when you were standing next to him, you were standing next to genius, I mean, it was always there, always, from that moment on.
It seems that meetings with Steve Church first meetings with Steve are not forgotten. In fact, I met Steve back in 1994. I was a contract engineer. Telos was reaching out to contract engineers to, make sure that people like me, who were making decisions on what to install in radio stations, knew about Telos gear. And in fact, at that time, I had installed very little Telos gear. Only when a customer says we got to have this because we think it's the best. My impression was Telos stuff was not the least expensive, and a lot of my customers wanted whatever was least expensive. Anyway, so I got to go up to Telos, learn about their gear, and meet Steve. And I also learned about their new product, this Telos Zephyr, and how it was going to replace satellite links for high-quality outside broadcast. More on that coming up. Well, there's another fellow that you need to know about, and he's a designer of audio processors. He got started kind of like Steve did, just playing with stuff, just building it and seeing what would work, and learning by doing it wrong 100 times or more. And this guy is Cornelius Gould. Now, Corny's a longtime radio engineer in Cleveland. Right now, I interviewed Corny a couple days ago, and Corny recalls his first encounter with Steve Church.
I think the first time I met Steve was I was working in a radio station, and we had a Telos 10, and one of the buttons stopped working. And so I figured, hey, we need a new button. So the boss said, you fix it, So, okay. So I figured out where Telos is. Oh, it's in town. So I called by there, and I guess it would be Steve that answered the phone. And we've got the parts, come on by. And told me where to go. And I walked over to the then headquarters of Telos, which was, I don't know how big the staff was at the time, but it was just the people that greeted me were Steve and Rich, and that's all I really noticed. And Steve gave me the button, and we had a little conversation. He told me how to replace the button because the Telos 10 was one of the first early devices that used this ribbon printed circuit. There was like this yellow plastic with the traces, and you see it a lot when you open up phones and stuff now, like iPhones and things, but that was very unusual. So he gave me a little quick several-minute lesson on how to desolder the button off of that without destroying it and putting a new one on. And it's like, okay, great. So how much do I owe you? How much is it? It's just Nothing. Just put it in and make it work. Go make radio.
A recurring theme about Steve Church was his insatiable curiosity. I guess a lot of inventors have that. Hey, a lot of engineers that I know have this insatiable curiosity about technology, especially as that technology applies or can be applied to audio or to radio broadcasting. Here's some more from Corny.
After that meeting, I got to know Steve and got to know him enough that he was a night owl and he was work all night. So I was about to test an early version of my Audio Chameleon processor. It was like the very first one, actually, and it was going to go on the air in the radio station, but management didn't want me to put it on until after midnight. They didn't really have a total trust in this fresh 20-year-old kid and the high-powered 20-kilowatt full-grade signal in the market. So after midnight, not a minute before. So I got the unit ready, tested out, make sure it was going, kind of nervous, and then I had 4 hours to kill. So I called up, the chit-chat with Steve, and of course he was there, and just kind of mentioned what I was up to, and I would love to see it. May I come by and see this? I was like, sure, Steve Church, Telos guy, the inventor. Why? Yeah, sure, come on by. I'll be right over. And he just walked over from Telos and sat down in the radio station newsroom with me where I had the unit set up and I was kind of tweaking on it. And he looked at it, and I'm thinking he's going to go, well, you really should do it this way. You show something to people and a lot of times people just criticize it, well, why did you use that? And Steve was like, sounds really good. And tell me all about it. And we must have spent a couple hours just him picking my brain. What was I thinking about with this and that? He got the whole picture and he goes, now, have you considered using, I go, wow, no, I'd never thought. Well, let me tell you about that. And he'll tell me a little bit, but he wouldn't tell me the whole answer. He'll tell enough to make you curious. And then, have you considered this type of a gate? And, well, I was thinking, no, it was, what kind of a freeze? What are you going to do for gating? Do you have any gating in here? I was like, no, not yet, but I'm going to put some in the next iteration. Okay. Have you considered, this kind of a gate? I'm going, wow, that sounds interesting. What does it do? Okay. And he describes the gate to me, and it's like, I think I might try it. Well, you know where you find one? In the Telos 10. Oh, really? Yes. I believe you've got one, so you've got a user's manual somewhere. Open it, it's in there. Go look it up. So I was okay, great. And I go and poke around with this gate, and sure enough, it's pretty cool. And so were the other ideas that allowed me to investigate and tune it. So in many ways, Steve Church's fingerprints are all over, the work I've done in the Audio Chameleon. And I kept adding onto it and developing, and eventually led to what's inside our friend the Omni 11 here. So,
well, as it's been said, as steel sharpens steel, Steve attracted other people who wanted to be around someone who was creative, who wanted to share and debate. Oh boy, Steve could debate. Not in an aggressive, hateful way, but just to get all the ideas out there on the table. He would debate technical ideas and not so technical ideas. Here's my colleague Denny Sanders to talk a bit about that.
Steve was like a magnet who attracted clever people. He had a way of defining whether or not someone had the potential to do great things, even if they hadn't done great things yet. And he just had this radar and this analysis gene that, I don't know where he got it, that spending time with an individual, he could tell whether or not they had the potential to do great things, even if they hadn't done any yet. He was amazing that way, amazing.
Sometimes the best way to determine if someone is both curious and capable is, well, try them out. How about contracting with them maybe to do a small project? Generally can work. See how it goes. Well, another colleague, and this guy is the director of research at Telos, or the director of technology, but he does all kinds of research. His name is Shay. This guy is a scientist level researcher, technologist, development guy. He really gets into the nitty-gritty of any technical issue, problem, or thing that we're doing at Telos. So when Greg Shay actually applied to Telos, see if they were interested in hiring him, and Steve, when he met with Greg, well, they did exactly that.
And one day I'm down in my basement, I get a phone call at home, and my wife says, it's this guy named Steve Church, you want to talk to him? I'm like, yeah. So I talked to Steve, and he was interested to meet me, and I came down and talked to him and Frank, and they had this, piece of DSP code they needed to have written, which was the stereo generator in the Omnia, and they only had one of the DSPs left out of 12 in the Omnia, so there wasn't that much space. So I got set up with the assembler and the simulator and worked on it and simulated it and pretty much had it doing what it should. So the first time I gave it back to Frank, it actually worked and it ran and had really good specs and kind of really blew him away, and he was impressed. So that's what you want to do, I guess, for a potential new employer. So after that, they wanted me to come to work here.
Well, people who knew Steve often were slightly intimidated. Steve was smart. He was really smart. He had an opinion, a well-informed opinion, in fact, on just about everything. He had no desire whatsoever to intimidate anyone. That didn't occur to him that he was doing that. He would be surprised if you told him that you felt a little over your head in a conversation with him. Here's another comment about that.
One of the beauties of Steve was he made it look easy. He really did. But he worked hard, I know before he and I put Cutting Edge and Telos together, which was 20 years ago, I know he worked hard because we were kind of like unofficial advisors to the other, although Telos was, light years ahead of what Cutting Edge was doing, which became Omnia. But even once we hooked up, it was nothing. Steve would pull all-nighters like crazy. And there were a lot of times I'd be on my way out the door, 5, 6 o'clock, and Steve was on his way in the door, and the reverse would be happening the next day when I'd be heading in, he'd be heading out. And I remember, I think this had to do with the Zephyr. He needed to come up with a way to make a PLL, and he racked his brain for days. And I remember the day he made it happen. He was so excited, Now, to some people, that might seem like a small thing, but when you were doing stuff back then and you didn't have the tools that we have for development today, that was a lot of hard work. So, to the outside world, he made it look easy. Much in the same way, when we, I know I'm dating myself by saying this, but when we listen to like the Beatles records, we thought, it appeared that they made it look easy. But as you read, John, Paul, George, they worked their butts off in that studio. Steve did too.
Steve had been researching a developing technology known as audio coding during the latter part of the 1980s. Well, he made a trip to a small town in Germany to visit a research lab known as Fraunhofer. There he learned of an exciting audio coding algorithm that was known, here's how it was known as. It was known as ISO MPEG Layer III audio coding. Actually, it's ISO MPEG-2 Layer III. That's what it was. ISO MPEG-2 Layer III audio coding. Yeah, we know it as MP3 today, right? Well, a gentleman by the name of Harold Popp, he's the head of the Department of Multimedia Real-Time Systems at Fraunhofer. Harold, in an interview recently, recalled his first encounter with Steve. He said, "He came with me spontaneously from a trade show in Europe by train to do a listening session at our labs. And Steve asked to hear some of his favorite music. So we listened intensively to Yes's Owner of a Lonely Heart. Remember that from the early 1980s? Steve got very excited about this. Harold believes that he decided then and there to cooperate with Fraunhofer, which was very much an unknown entity at the time, especially in audio coding. Well, according to Harold Popp, the resulting agreements between Telos and Fraunhofer helped Fraunhofer significantly to sustain and continue their R&D work on audio codecs. Those are Harold Popp's words. Well, a few years ago, 2004, was the 10th anniversary of the Telos Zephyr. Boy, that means we're almost to the 20th anniversary now, here in 2012. Well, 2004 was the 10th anniversary of the Zephyr, and at the NAB convention in Las Vegas, Steve Church, he was there and he recounted the story. This is pretty interesting. You got to tune into this. He recounted the story of just how MP3 and Telos got together.
An ISDN codec, and at that time, if you can remember back almost 12 years ago, not only was digital a really fresh and new thing within the broadcast world, but ISDN telephone lines were not yet available. I heard they would be, so I started off to try to find some way to make them work for our application in broadcast, to make high fidelity transmission over long distances a reality without waiting 2 months for the telephone company to install a line and so forth. I thought it would be just great if you could walk up to a piece of equipment. I mean, this was my dream all through the conception of the Zephyr, having worked as an engineer for years and fighting with the telephone company and so forth to install broadcast loops. I thought it would be so great if there could just be some equipment in the rack. You could walk up to it, punch the buttons yourself, and be connected at the other end without having to ask the telephone company to do it or to tell them they did it wrong and please will they come back and do it again and so forth. So I thought if we could do that, that would be really great. But we depended upon two things. We had to have a codec that would work in the number of bits we had in the telephone network, and we had to have the telephone network with digital connectivity. So we had the first one. I visited Germany because that was the center of audio coding research, and went to visit the people at Fraunhofer who were the inventors of MP3. We convinced them to license MP3 to us. We were the very first organization in the world to license MP3. In fact, at the time, Fraunhofer didn't know what they were going to do with the technology because MPEG-2 had been chosen for digital radio in Europe, and now they had this technology, and what were they going to do? So he and I walked and said, maybe we can try it for this radio station application. They said, well, okay, let's think about it. And actually, they thought about it for 2 days, and I was waiting in a small town in Germany for an answer. And finally, I came back, and they said, no, we're still not ready yet to give you an answer. But there was a building materials store not too far from the laboratory, and it was the only interesting thing around. So they said, please come back in 4 hours, we'll have an answer for it. So I walked down to the building materials laboratory and looking at different hammers and so forth and thinking, this is really something. I'm looking at hammers, you know, technology has been around for how many thousands of years, and over in the laboratory, they're thinking about this very high technology, sophisticated, you know, modern stuff. And this contrast was still on my brain when I went back to them, and yes, they said, we've decided we're going to license it to you, and congratulations, and we hope it works, and so on and so forth. So then I had that technology. I came back to the U.S., and then we had to decide, well, we're going to have to dedicate a lot of resources to this. It's going to cost us a lot of money to develop it. It's all new technology for us. The telephone ISDN is all new technology. The coding is new technology. But we had a lot of experience already with DSP. And I remember speaking with Frank, my partner, and I said, Frank, you know, I licensed this, and I think it's a pretty good idea still, but I'm really nervous because we could invest all this money and time that we could be using for something better, and we could be making better audio processors or telephone hybrids or whatever. And we don't know if we're ever going to have telephone lines to connect this to. And also, we don't know really if the world wants this. I mean, we know the world wants audio processors and telephone hybrids because we've been selling a lot of them, and this was a whole new product category, and the other products were completely, the codec idea was a completely new and different one. So it was risky, very untested. And so Frank and I went to dinner one evening, and I told him, you know, I'm having second thoughts. Maybe we shouldn't do this crazy codec idea. But really, it's just wild. You know, I don't know what I was thinking. I was over there with the hammers in the building materials store. Maybe I just wasn't thinking straight. And anyway, over the course of the evening, we decided, in fact, Frank convinced me that this is a risk we should take, that it's in our blood, that really we are pioneers, it's our nature. Yes, and if we're not pioneering, we're not going to be happy. So let's be pioneers, let's take the risk, let's do it. And what the hell, if ISDN doesn't happen in the US, it'll happen in Europe. We'll sell some in Europe and recover our investment anyway. Well, it just happened. We were very fortunate that the development of the Zephyr, the original Zephyr, took about 2 years. And between the time we decided to go on the project and the time that we completed it and got it on market 2 years later, ISDN was really growing in the U.S. And it just all came together at the right time. The Zephyr just surprised us like crazy when it took off as it did. It very quickly surpassed our telephone hybrid products as our main line of work, and has continued to surprise and amaze us. After all of these years, we're celebrating actually the sale of more than 10,000 of these. 10,000. There's 10,000 radio stations in the United States. It means every station's got one. How did that happen? Yeah. Of course, it's not really that way. I mean, there are some stations that don't have any, and some that have half a dozen. A lot of Europeans have them too, but still, it's very many. In the broadcast industry, it's very many pieces. Those of you who work in the industry on our side of it as manufacturers understand that for a product to sell 10,000 pieces is almost phenomenal. In fact, we've been saying that it's the most successful product in the digital era in the radio broadcast industry, and no one's challenged us on it yet. So, and we've been saying it for about a year, so I guess it's probably true. So I thank you for those of you who have, for contributing to its success. We're still making them. If you're still thinking of ways to use them, we're happy that you are, and we're happy to have you here. And we're so happy, in fact, that we've set you up with some free food, which you're probably a lot more interested in than listening to me talk more. So I will stop at this point and invite you to join us for food and drink and comradeship. Thank you.
Good story. Good story from Steve. Well, if you're not in broadcasting yourself, you may not really know, what did the Telos Zephyr do for radio stations? Here's another perspective on that. Denny Sanders says it changed everything. Listen.
A friend of mine had developed an audio processor, and we were kind of showing it around the country. And he didn't want to travel, so he sent me to radio stations all over the place and ended up meeting a lot of really smart people around the country. And we went to Indianapolis to meet Steve Church. And I didn't know anything about him, but we started talking about PBXs and telephones, and it went on. And I now know why that happens, because that's sort of the norm. Once a conversation gets going, it just goes off into all these different directions, And it was just fascinating, and we became friends. And phone calls would go back and forth, and we'd see each other once in a while. And occasionally, after he got the company going, I put Telos 10s anywhere I possibly could because it solved the problem. And he would call if he had a particularly strange installation and wanted it to go well, because phones have been my obsession for a really long time. So I ended up going some pretty big radio stations and putting the stuff in and making it work for them.
Sorry, we got the wrong cut there. We'll see if we can correct that. While Steve Church made great sounding phones possible, radio stations and talk shows, that they wanted better ways of handling multiple calls and on a dozen or more phone lines. And that's what Joe Talbot was just telling us about improving phone call systems like that. Well, as the available technology progressed, new ideas begged for implementation. We learned that ISDN lines were not only connected to codecs like the Telos Zephyr, but we could also use ISDN lines to improve voice telephone calls as well. Well, Greg Shay worked with Steve to invent new talk show systems that made the callers using ISDN lines at this radio station end, and just normal cell phones or analog POTS phone lines at the caller end, to make callers sound even better. Here's Greg.
Well, typically, knowing what we were trying to build, we would go visit some key customers or people who he knew had the need, and we would talk to them and kind of find out firsthand, what is important. So for instance, it was time for a new generation of phone systems, which became the 2X12 and the 2101. So we went and visited a big station, and they talked about how, you know, there was no good way to really share a bunch of phone lines between studios. And so then we would come back and you know, I worked on the design, worked on the plan, and we would go from there. A little story about that, which was part of learning. I learned from Steve kind of a balance between getting the product right, but not getting so sidetracked off in, you know, sometimes an engineer will get so wrapped up in what he's doing, you know. It's got to be perfect, it's got to be huge, it's got to be, you know, take a long time. So always pragmatic, you know. Steve would want you to just make it enough, but yet if there was something clever that you could do to give that extra edge, you know, at the end, he'd want that. So for instance, we had done the desktop director. There's like a museum over here with about 3 different models of it. And we had blinking LEDs and multicolored LEDs. And Steve had been to a trade show, and he saw these little dot matrix display things, and he thought, you know, that would be perfect for some sort of symbols, you know, that would show the state of the line. So we redesigned it relatively late in the game and put the status symbols on it. And I had been fooling around with the idea of animating those little symbols, but it wasn't in like the first version that we had. And so Steve was looking at it, and then I showed him one of the animations, and he says, you know what? He says, you know, do it. Can you do this? And of course, you know, ask an engineer, can you do this, you know? So I ran back to my desk and turned on the animations and stuff, and it's like, and he really liked that. So that became, you know, that little icing on the cake. So Steve always said, it's got to, the product has to be really easy to use, but do magical things, see? So that was always the key, you know, you had to have that little bit of magic on there, but don't make it too complicated.
Boy, where have you heard that before? Maybe some other developers named Steve. Well, you know, as Telos grew, so did the company's need for top-line development and engineers. Well, a chance conversation between Steve and a really wise Telos dealer in Europe led Steve to a small and yet very beautiful country, Latvia.
Well, he pretty much went every place, and he ended up, I guess by accident, he ended up in Riga and discovered that there was a company in Riga that used to make all the switchgear for the phone system in Russia. A company called VEF, V-E-F, and I would tell you what it means, but oof. Anyway, so he ended up finding a lot of really creative and talented engineers there, and then went to the university and found the gold mine that we have now. I mean, there's just, the talent available there is amazing. Great people. So, but he would constantly, he'd go places where he shouldn't go. I guess he went into some place in Russia to a factory to see about having them possibly fabricate some gear for us, and ended up stumbling into a kind of, the other part of the operation was sort of secret. And that wasn't real comfortable. I guess they held him for a little while because he was completely innocent, but it looked bad, you know. This American guy stumbling around, you know.
Well, using some fresh yet stable technology and introducing the right product at the right time and presenting the user interface in a fresh and yet somewhat familiar way, these are all challenges that face any product designer. You know, products that you use, hold in your hand, interface with every day, they usually have a lot of thought behind them. And if they don't, I guess you can probably tell. Well, Steve Church kept thinking about problem solving, about thinking out of the box. He kept actually forcing conversations about new techniques and new technologies.
The Zephyr changed everything. Up until Zephyr, there was really only 2 ways you could do a live remote from a distant location. By satellite, which was expensive. It was one way. You had to book it weeks, if not months in advance. And in order to originate, let's say, from Disney World in Florida, you'd have to have a live telephone hookup back to the stations so you could hear them. So you would have a satellite connection, very expensive. a 4 or 5 hour long distance phone call back to Cleveland or New York or LA, wherever the station was. And you couldn't work quickly. You'd have to book this whole thing months in advance. And it was very expensive. The Zephyr changed everything. It meant that any radio station, regardless of what size, could broadcast a remote broadcast from any location, so long as there was an ISDN line and you had a second Zephyr that you could bring with you and interconnect to. Therefore, if your home team suddenly got into the World Series, you could broadcast from the other city without worrying about time lag and any other kind of complication that wouldn't allow you to be so flexible. I have to tell you a story about the Zephyr that's amazing. One night, when I was still doing radio, Steve called me. This was around 1993. And he says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Nothing." He says, "Come on over." So I came over, and we went into the little studio at Telos in those days, and he said, "Where do you think this music's coming from?" And I said, "I don't know, CD player or something." He says, "No, it's not local." I said, "Well, it's by satellite." And he says, "No, it's not by satellite." I said, "Well, it can't be through AT&T long line. Nobody does that anymore." "No, it's coming from Germany." "Not satellite? How are you getting it?" And he described the codec. It was a prototype Zephyr, and he was picking up music from Fraunhofer in Germany. And he said to me, "You know, I think there might be a market for this."
Well, there was a big telephony project brewing in Riga, Latvia. Steve had another idea, an idea that kept him awake at night even more than usual. And Steve was thinking about the way audio was routed around a broadcast plant. As the digital age dawned, most radio plants were still analog, and a typical major market station usually had hundreds of punch blocks and miles of multi-conductor audio cable. It was a system that was very costly to install and took a lot of people to maintain. Computer networks, on the other hand, were completely different. Through the use of packet switching technology, a single Ethernet cable could carry multiple signals without any of them getting mixed up. Well, again, Steve Church saw potential in this emerging technology, and he wondered, since a single packet switching and Ethernet topology works so well for data, is there a way we can adapt this to route audio around the broadcast plant? And of course, plenty of skeptics said, no, you can't do that. Heck, half the time you hit print and something doesn't print. How are we going to get audio around reliably? So there were too many unsolvable problems, this skeptic said, such as latency and lost packets and prioritizing audio over other traffic in the network. Well, Greg Shay talks about the early days of thinking about and then implementing low latency IP audio.
When we first developed Livewire, it was based on the premise that we knew every computer out there had a network jack. And we said, wouldn't it be great if we can figure out how to use that network jack, which was already there, as the audio interface, rather than having to add sound cards. So kind of an extension from that, we knew that, the world has networks, but we knew also, the internet and all that wasn't quite up to snuff to actually handle, studio quality audio. So we set out to develop the in-studio, audio over network solution, knowing that someday the rest of the world would catch up, and essentially then you could just use the same kind of technology for basically everywhere. And that's, that whole, really that's like looking, 10, 15, 20 years into the future, of which we're about halfway there. So that seems to be on track.
One engineer who worked with Steve and with Greg Shay and a few others to get audio information through a computer network is a friend of mine and colleague, fellow from Poland. His name is Maciej Szlapka. Here's Maciej.
First time I met Steve was by the phone. He called me on my in my room at the campus at the university where I was studying at, that was in France. So he called, he knew he was calling France, so he said bonjour. He spoke French to me because that was appropriate. That was it's known that Steve is fluent in many languages. So. Oh, he called me because he heard from Peter Kubacki, the Telos dealer in Poland, that I was looking for an internship as part of my studies. So Peter told me that he has a guy who's interested in programming and looking for an internship, and Steve was always looking for people to work at the company, and he thought that would maybe a good addition to the team, so he called me and convinced me to come to the United States for my internship.
Well, the end result of the collaboration between Steve and Greg Shay and Maciej and a number of other engineers was Livewire. And that employs a linear audio over IP method. The technology is, well, it's the new wave of signal routing within a broadcast network. And now there's not only Livewire, but there are other similar technologies. And now there's even a collaboration between Livewire and a technology, a standard known as Ravenna. So that they're talking to each other. And I think as time goes on, we'll see more and more collaboration and handshaking between these different things. Today, Livewire is employed in literally thousands of facilities worldwide. There are well over 3,000 just Axia brand audio over IP consoles around the world. And there are other brands as well that are running audio over IP. So there's a lot of it out there. I have some at my radio stations, and it just works and works and works. Here's the next clip. I'm sorry I didn't do a very good job of introducing this one, but as I said, there is a lot of this Livewire audio over IP on the air around the world.
I know that Steve actually was always even trying to train himself to be creative, and the process of invention is not like an incident and not an accident, and it doesn't come free. So it was always a lot of work, and Steve was always working very hard. He was always working long hours and staying very late at the office. People say that those late hours, about 8 p.m., are the most efficient hours, and so Steve was using every single moment he could just to think about things, talk about ideas, and invent, trying to come up with some new products and best solutions.
You know, about the time that Livewire was being developed, Steve moved to Latvia full-time and set up a research center in the capital of Latvia, Riga. And that involved, by the way, a partnership between Telos and the University of Riga. They were opening a department that would do outside contracting work, research work, and basically. And they were looking for sponsors at that time. So in exchange for funding, Telos received access to research students and professors there, as well as a ready supply of recent graduates to work on projects, some of whom are working on them right now. At this point, Livewire was ready for prime time. The first consoles were built and tested. And after a number of smaller installations were done, a really big installation, big for Livewire at the time, 9 consoles, 9 studios, was coming up in New York City. And some fairly new Telos engineers, folks who had just been hired, they were going to experience the triumph of a successful technology. It's a great time for them. And they also got to experience the warmth of being part of Steve's Telos family.
The first Axia install that I partook in was WOR in New York. We had this, it was like a 9-studio install with a smart surface. Maciej and I went out to New York to help with the install. We had pre-set up the gear in the office, configured it to some degree so we had a good working idea. And then we went out to New York and started the install. Mike Doss showed up a couple days into it, and unbeknownst to me, I didn't know that Steve was going to show up and give us his blessing. And he showed up near the end, came through the studios, walked through, and was just beaming. He was so proud of the accomplishment that Axia had done and what Mike had pushed forward, and where we had come for so long and all the R&D, and here was the final result. And he was so happy and so proud. I think there was a gleam in his eye that I'd never seen before. And he was proud of that accomplishment, and he wanted to celebrate. So afterwards, knowing Steve, he's this connoisseur of fine wine and food, and he's got his book. He brings out his book, and he's looking in his book. He goes, there's this place here, City Hall. Yeah, we got to go to this place called City Hall. And we struggled to try to find a taxi cab to get to this place. And we finally got there, and I remember having one of the best ribeyes I had ever had in my life. And Steve was up there, and we toasted the Mike and the accomplishments we did with Axia, and it was a great time, because I was actually now involved with Steve on a social level for the first time in my life. I got to see that side of him that I'd never seen before. It was all business up to that point, and now it was social. And it was a great feeling to be part of this, and I felt like I was part of a family at that point.
A lot of us have felt that way too. Hey, back in 2010, Steve, along with Skip Peasy, authored the book Audio over IP, Building Pro AOIP Systems with Livewire. It's a good-looking book, and it's from Focal Press, and it's available online. He was well published in numerous trade publications too. He had written a lot of white papers and given technical presentations at the NAB, the AES, the Audio Engineering Society, the IEEE, also at SMPTE, and various other technical forums, as well as contributing the broadcast telephony sections of the NAB Engineering Handbook. He had written for those. In 2010, Steve Church also received the NAB's Radio Engineering Award. Quite an accomplishment there. A new technology and a new product line for Telos, indeed one that Steve worked on with our Latvian team, is Voice over IP, or you might say VoIP. Steve envisioned a multi-studio, multi-line talk show system that could natively use SIP trunks carrying voice over IP calls. SIP is a voice protocol. SIP is a VoIP protocol, and it's the most popular one of the VoIP protocols. It's the one that's pretty much taken over. It allows real flexibility and economy in handling phone calls over private networks and over IP connections like private networks or the internet. These connections, well, the audio quality, let's talk about that. The audio quality is usually better than on regular phone calls. You have hardly any chance of hum or a poor connection, a crackly connection, because it is IP audio. It's digital at that point. And now, if you've got a smartphone, you can get an app. There are free apps and some paid apps that can place a high-quality phone call from your smartphone to your on-air talk show system. Joe Talbot here, he explains that this what this cutting-edge tech is going to mean for businesses and for broadcasters.
Well, he recognized very early on, and to be honest, when this started out, I thought it was too early. I thought we were going to be spending a lot of time educating people, and we've done a little less than that than I thought. It seems right now that the timing was exactly right. But he recognized that there would be other codecs. He recognized that VoIP opened the phone network to the broadcaster like they've never had before. And of course, it lowered costs, and these days that's huge. So he saw all that, and he liked the idea of basically handling it at the stream level. And that really, it was simpler. I mean, there's certainly a lot of software behind it that makes it work well, but in terms of hardware, it decreased the complexity and the cost to do it really, really well. It was completely digital end to end, and he saw the value in that.
So can you describe for a moment, in the VX system, what do broadcasters have in their hands with VX and voice over IP in a broadcast facility?
Well, the thing I like most is they have complete flexibility. I mean, they can have any line in any studio working any way they want. It's flexibility like they've never had, and it's really reliable because it's simple. I mean, the parts count is so much less. The boxes are simple. They're doing one job. It's dedicated to that task, and it does it really well. So, I mean, they can do new things, like they can take the calls on using G722, so they get 7 kilohertz audio using using an iPhone or using a different piece of hardware, using a zip, one of our zip codecs. So that's kind of nice. It's not an option that's been available. And just treat it like a regular phone call. And that's been real popular. People like that. At first you tell them about it and they think, really? And then think about it a little bit. And, yeah, I guess we could do that. And then they implement it and then there's no going back.
Steve's focus on creativity and invention were very purposeful and disciplined, according to our colleague Maciej Szlapka.
Yeah, all Steve's ideas were so challenging, not only to him, but to the entire team. So I think that this is something that impressed everybody and kept engaged. And that's why working for TELUS was always so interesting. And there was never a moment that you wouldn't feel challenged, and you were always forced to learn more and to investigate, to do research. And this is what Steve was doing, and that what his personality was actually radiating on everybody.
Something I didn't know about Steve that I learned from Maciej a few days ago is this: Steve didn't allow little hurdles to get in the way of his goals. For example, parking tickets.
Yeah, Steve was not worrying about things which were not that important really to his life or to the business. So whenever we would go to see another team at the Latvian University, for example, he would park on whatever spot was the closest to the door, regardless if it was allowed to park there or not. And of course, the parking tickets sometimes he had to pay, but they were just cost of doing business.
Thinking about problems from every conceivable angle and debating the problem and possible solutions, these exercises were very much part of Steve's nature.
He would always try to not just settle back on one idea or do something a certain way because that's just how it's done. I mean, he seemed to be very uncomfortable with that. I mean, there's always what if there's another way? And if you were to, there's been times where, like for mic processing, I was, thinking of things that have been in my head for a while on mic processing, and I got into a discussion with Steve one evening where we were talking about things that had nothing to do with compression and limiting, but have an effect on how voices would sound through a mic processor. And then he lit up, yes, I thought a lot about this. And we went on and just talked about all these little things that happen and could be possibly happening in various units people used as mic processing over the years that they've loved. And you look at them and it's like, well, there's not really much to it. It's what's so special about it? And it's certainly not the compressor in this thing. And there's all these other all these other items and components that were chosen most likely because it was the cheapest component you could buy at the time. But there's something about that combination that adds a certain effect to the voice that people come, to love out of that particular box. And each box had its own characteristics because of the decisions made by the designers that had nothing to do with the processor part.
How did Steve mentor the engineers and other creative people that he engaged with? Well, Corny gave an example, and then he gives some more here.
I think he got a kick out of he may have an answer on how to do it. I mean, well, Steve always had an opinion on, how it should go. But I think he loved watching people find a path to an answer, maybe discover something new. I think he just got a kick out of just watching someone pick up and run and create something new and push themselves and go into new territories. When Steve was ill, and even if there was a day where he was in a lot of discomfort and just having a hard time focusing on the day, if I were come by to visit and start talking about what I'm working on right now, he would light right up, and it just lock in, and so tell me about that. So have you considered, again, have you considered this, or have you ever heard of that? I mean, it's like the sickness didn't exist for that moment. He was just, I think watching someone grow, challenge, and also challenge him, by sharing your thoughts and ideas and getting him to think a different way.
Church was an intensely inquisitive person. I think we've discussed that a lot here. He read for pleasure, and yet his subject matter covered just about everything. He possessed a passion for science fiction, along with an extreme interest in another well-known and self-made entrepreneur, inventor, and a contributor to our world, and that would be Thomas Alva Edison. Well, shortly before his death, Steve visited the Thomas Edison Museum in West Orange, New Jersey.
That's an easy answer because, matter of fact, I feel Steve with me right now, and he'd be saying, Frank, you know, where did I learn it? Thomas Edison. You know, Steve and I in recent years, we spent hours talking about Thomas Edison. And if anyone's taken the time to read about Edison, you know, we know him as, he created a light bulb and the motion picture and the phonograph record, all great things in our world. But Edison had thousands of things that were failures. I don't mean that he failed, but, you know, because he tried something. And, you know, like in this computer over here, you know, I tell my stepdaughter, you know, and she says, Frank, I can't get this right the first time. And I'll say, Milena, do you know how many thousands of iterations of an Omni algorithm that they don't work? But you did it. And Steve would be saying, the only way that you're going to raise the bar is you got to think outside. First, you got to think outside the box, first of all, and you got to make new mistakes. You know, if you're not making new mistakes, then you're playing not to lose. And if you're playing to win, every once in a while, you know, I know Steve was. I shouldn't say that he wasn't an athlete because his sport of choice was debate. But in sports, you know, if the game's on the line, you got to take a chance, and you got to try something that's unconventional. You know, when you look at the things we've done, he did, or we've done, you know, and when I say we, I mean as a company, or he and I together, or us and our colleagues together, we thought outside the box, you know, and we weren't afraid to, you know, step over that line. And so if you're someone who's got ideas and dreams, if you don't have dreams, start drinking something or smoking something or doing something. And look, I'm not trying to tell you to be immoral, but you got to, you know, let that mind go. And Steve let his mind go. I let my mind go. And you got to, you know, you got to go for it, you know. Steve was a very modest guy, you know, and would almost feel kind of bashful, you know, that we're I'm sure inside he'd be feeling, wow, you know, it's nice that people think of me this way. But, you know, I remember when he received the NAB Engineering Award, he was all, I mean, and I remember even when he was, you know, accepting the award, he's like, you know, he almost felt like that people might be looking at him as a has-been, of which he wasn't. But he almost felt like self-conscious of it. And he was a very, very humble person. I mean, he really was. His ego was outside the building, you know. And I also think that's something that if people are, you know, chase your dreams, never stop asking questions, research, and go about it with an honest heart, and you'll do okay.
You know, Steve recently said, I think this is very nice too. Steve recently wrote, radio is a bit like a kiss, no? When passion takes a grip, a kiss connects two humans in an exchange of secrets and emotions. We kiss furtively, lasciviously, gently, shyly, hungrily, exuberantly. We kiss in broad daylight and in the dead of night. We give ceremonial kisses, affectionate kisses, Hollywood air kisses, kisses of death, and in fairy tales, pecks that revive princesses or princes. And at its best, and in our imagination, radio has such a variety and a similar power. It's well known that one's lifelong musical taste is pretty much imprinted during the teen years. Also, Steve writing here. Our connection to radio might be as well. How many of us during those sensitive years, listening to a great DJ or talk show host, decided we want to be part of that? Think about the vast numbers of people for whom work is is just work. And consider how fortunate we are to have found a vocation bound in such a way to our inner spirit. Well, thanks for being here for this edition of This Week in Radio Tech. Next week, it's episode number 140, and being an episode number that's divisible by 10, it's going to be a War Stories episode. I hope you'll join us. I'm Kirk Harnack for This Week in Radio Tech. Bye-bye.